Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University. I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, projects that imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, oppression, war, and empire. And one of our projects is this discussion with organizers, activists, and social change agents about the work that they do. My guest today is Nicole Berland. Nicole is a doctoral candidate at the University of North Carolina in English and comparative literature. She teaches film there, focusing on speculative fiction and seriality as a narrative form. She has been for a long time an activist who works in organizing reading groups. The idea of activists and organizers meeting together to read and share ideas through shared readings has been a tradition for a long, long time. Going back, we can say even to early Enlightenment liberal radicals who met together in cafes and in pubs to share pamphlets and ideas of readings, and in the French salons or in the American colonies amongst the committees of correspondence. Of course, there's one of the most famous amongst radical groups is the reading group that Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs conducted together for over 10 years in the rural parts of Maine with some of their radical colleagues discussing how to think about society and social change. Nicole Berland has been organizing reading groups for quite a long time, and I wanted us to be able to talk a little bit about why she has decided in some ways to use the format of reading groups as a way to use her time for activist organizing. So welcome, Nicole. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You and I met in October of 2011 in Austin, Texas. I had come to a conference there for the Concerned Philosophers for Peace, and I think that one of my colleagues had organized a panel of activists from Occupy Austin to come in. And so you did a presentation about the Occupy Austin reading group, which you had created and were facilitating there. And you talked a little bit about the work that you were doing with the reading group. And then you went on to, I think, publish an article that was circulated on the internet about the reading group's work. So I wanted to ask you about this. Why did you think that a reading group was the best way for you to engage with the Occupy Wall Street movement?
So I'd like to say that a lot of thought went into it, but it really felt more like a compulsion. So I had just been laid off from Roosevelt University in Chicago, where I had been working as an adjunct instructor. And I just moved back to Austin, and Occupy Austin began, and I went to one of the organizing meetings, and they told people to think about what skills and resources you had to offer. And I was thinking, you know, gosh, I really am just a teacher and a reader. So I think that's what I have to offer. So I have these, in moments of crisis, I tend to have these dual impulses to understand and to connect. You know, I seek information, I try to make connections intellectually, but I also want to connect with my community. And so I just thought this would be a good way to do all of the above and share it with the community. I tend to have this, you know, awareness, I guess, realization that fascism is allergic and all kinds of oppression are allergic to critical thought. So I thought, hey, it can't hurt. Let's see if anybody's interested. And it was actually really funny. I mean, it was funny to me. I got up in front of these hundreds of people. I was so, like, my heart was pounding a million miles a minute. And I just said, I'm going to go read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Would anybody like to come? This is where I will be. And the crowd just erupted. People were super stoked on it. And then lots of people came, and it was just extremely popular and successful, and I couldn't even believe it, but it was very fun.
I know the encampment at Austin was fairly well sized, right? And so, how many folks did you have at that very first sort of reading of King?
I think the first meeting was probably a couple dozen.
Hmm.
Um, and over the course of the months that we were meeting before I moved away back or over here to North Carolina, there were hundreds of people who came through because I kept a listserv, and at one point I looked at all the emails collected on the listserv and I really couldn't believe my eyes how many people had come through and shared these like intellectual spaces with us.
So interesting. So, like after that initial spontaneous meeting, how did you describe, or how would you describe the way that you organize the regular meetings of the reading group? How did you get started to process that?
Well, so my year's meeting with students, having students in my classes, I learned a few things about when people are likely to participate. And so I decided to not give anybody homework. So the idea was that people would bring something we could read out loud together within 20 minutes and then discuss. It also had the benefit of allowing us to meet we were meeting in public spaces, obviously downtown at Occupy. So people could just be walking by and say, hey, what are you doing? And say, oh, just come read with us. So you could just spontaneously join. And so that was, I think, a really good move on my part, just in terms of getting engagement from a wide swath of people. And then I thought it would be important for people to have some buy-in, feeling like they owned it too. And so we had rotating facilitators who every time we met, and at first we were meeting every single day, which I can't believe we did that for months. I really can't believe it. But we had different people bring in texts to share. And so I wasn't in charge of finding all the material myself, which was great for me because it was less work, and I could also learn about texts that I didn't know about beforehand. And because people really felt, invested in the community that we were building.
So you didn't necessarily choose readings beforehand. It was you read stuff that people brought to the meetings themselves, or did people select readings ahead of time? Did you have a list? How did that work in terms of the selection of what you read?
At first it was kind of slapdash. I brought in the first text, and then a few people who I really trusted, just based on the first meeting, I kind of lined them up to bring in the next several texts to kind of set a tone. And then after a while, people started bringing in longer texts or less meaty texts, or maybe just like poems they'd written, which is cool in its own way. But so I kind of narrowed the parameters to be something previously written and published somewhere that anybody could access it. It just felt a little more democratic, and we would disseminate it electronically through the listserv, in addition to having people bring a few paper copies to pass around it if we had people just walking by who wanted them.
So what was the role of the facilitator that you were mentioning? You said that you sometimes facilitated these meetings, and then this was often traded amongst folks who were participating. How did the facilitator role work in the reading group?
It varied, and it's changed a lot between then and my most current iteration of the reading group, which we can talk about too later. At the time, I kind of was leaving it just as open as possible. I'd read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I was like, I'm not going to oppress anybody, and I would give people some guidelines, maybe based on what I'd learned teaching. It tended to end up with me facilitating, and I think that's partially just a function of me being kind of bossy. Eventually in that group, we settled into a structure that kind of ran itself. And I think that has just crystallized more and more with my next reading groups, where there would be kind of a sharing round where people would share first impressions, maybe questions they had. There'd be open discussion, and then if anybody had last thoughts, they would do that. And I would try to make sure that people who were trying to talk and maybe couldn't get a word in edgewise would have an opportunity. So I'd try and call out those voices when I could. And the rest was pretty much just people talking.
So let's talk about how, let's think about how the readings that you were doing for Occupy Austin, you were doing these out in the encampment, in so this kind of public space, and you had some regulars, I assume?
Oh yeah, we had a core group of maybe 30 people who would come in and out, and then there were maybe 5 people who were just always there every day with me.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, that's a big group. Did you ever have to do people's mic to be heard in the reading group?
No.
I'm just thinking because that's a large group to try to keep a conversation going. I mean, that's a classroom size group.
Yeah, it's true. I think that usually it would just kind of happen that there would be maybe a circle kind of closer in, and then observers who would occasionally chime in on the outside that could kind of like come and go. Maybe people with kids who were half paying attention, half watching their kids.
Yeah.
But usually I would say it was between 5 and 10 people at a time.
So let's talk about the role of the reading group in terms of the overall project of Occupy. How do you think that the reading group helped yours or other people's activism within Occupy? Like, what did this do for people who were involved in the movement itself?
So I think the way I'm going to answer you is going to be a little bit more generalizable, but I'll try and pin it to Occupy as much as I can. So in the first place, it brought people to the encampment every day, including myself. I completely would not have gone there every day, and if I didn't have a good reason to go there. And I know that we had people bring in excerpts from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals several times. And for some reason, one of the things that stuck with me the most was this sense that you need to make your movement fun. You need to have a reason for people to want to be there, or that just kind of compels them there. And so I think that did a lot. And then once you're there, you start seeing what other kinds of actions are going on, or whatever little collectives are forming. You also, by bringing all these people in, you're kind of fostering communication across groups of people you might not communicate with otherwise. And then you can do these kind of more linked actions between different communities. I think also, and this kind of goes to the text that I brought in, and I believe this deeply. This goes to the text that I brought in at the beginning, which is Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. So I'm really attached to this text. I read it at least once a year, and I've started every reading group out with it. I have a lot of reasons for being attached. I'm from Birmingham. Actually, a distant cousin of mine was one of the rabbis who wrote the letter to the Birmingham jail that he was responding to. And I think, just growing up Jewish in Birmingham in a family of educators, reading the letter all the time at the Civil Rights Museum in class, it just is important to me. And then, the Jewish background kind of made me think a lot about how important collective action is and the responsibility of witnesses to stand up against injustice. I don't know, it just seems like my text. And one thing he says, and I wrote down this quote, one thing he says that I think is so important is that, quote, in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. And he calls self-purification a necessary precursor to direct action. And I think that one of the mistakes that kind of budding activists make often is when they become aware of an issue, they just want to jump straight to action. And they don't think about who's already doing things. They don't think about who they might be endangering or putting in harm's way if they just jump straight to action. And they don't necessarily think about why they're doing what they're doing. And I was definitely, you know, like that, especially in college. Although luckily I hitched my wagon to people who had done their self-purification. But for his movement, self-purification was like trainings and workshops and, you know, starting like imagining what it would be like to be in jail and kind of getting right with it. And for us, for me, at least in the communities I've been moving in, I think that it's situating the grievances of the moment and the movement itself historically through reading. I think it's stretching your imaginations of what is possible or what kinds of tactics you might use. I think that it's starting to think about what you're willing to do in terms of both high risk and low risk tactics. I think it's also building community, which is so important. It's so much easier to go do something risky if you've got like a whole cadre of people behind you supporting you. And also clarifying your position so that you know, because there are a lot of positions you think would just be like clear, this is the progressive position or this is the left position. But there are a lot of nuances and there are different ways you can come down on it that affect how you engage with different activist communities and efforts and how and which ones you might want to engage with at all. And so when you do these readings, you get the benefit of just self-purifying on all those fronts and then collecting those kinds of resources. And I think that MLK is a great place to start because he talks about all different kinds of direct action. He talks about, you know, the danger of being a moderate. He talks about like how to make tension visible through direct action. And he talks about the importance of really like getting clear with yourself and your group and your values and your resources before you just jump into action. And so I'm hoping, and I believe that that really helped a lot of people within the context of Occupy. I know that it changed some people's lives. Some of the people who came through, I'm thinking specifically of one guy who was a taxi driver, and then he became one of our regulars who would show up every day. And then he just like went back to school and now he teaches middle school. He was like, I love learning. I love talking to people about ideas. I think it's important. We've got a lot of underserved populations here. Like, I'm just going to do it. And
wow,
so
that's
I
amazing.
know, isn't that cool? And then and then you made your reading group, which is still going, which blows my mind. And it makes me so happy.
Yeah, so I mean, I wanted to say a little about that. So after I met you in Austin that fall, I came back to here, Corvallis, Oregon, and we had just started our own Occupy here. We didn't have an encampment, but we had regular General Assembly meetings. And one of the things I proposed was to have a reading group based on what I saw, what was going on with you all down in Austin. And we, initially we had, 30 some odd folk coming out to it on a regular basis and different people coming in and out. And it was very similar to what you're discussing. Since we didn't have an encampment, we found it difficult to find places where necessarily to do the meetings. And so a lot of the times we were meeting either in university classrooms or in cafes. But, one of the things I remember very distinctly that we talked about in one of our meetings, and this was in a cafe somewhere, it must have been like in November or December of 2011. We were sitting in this cafe, and it was a mixed group of folks, you know, sort of townies, university people, elders, young folk, high school students. And the discussion centered around the idea of what does it mean to be in public? Because since we didn't have an encampment, we were always trying to figure out space issues, where to be, and what it meant for people to take up space. And how, in some sense, right, even the idea of public space in our society, right, public spaces really aren't public in a lot of ways because they're really sort of government owned spaces where people can get together, like public parks and things like that, right? It's very rare for us to be able to find places in which we can actually congregate without asking for permission or without having to spend money in order to be able to be in those spaces. And so we spent a lot of time talking about space. And I remember one young person at that meeting was just kind of blown away, and they said, you know, I imagine that these kinds of conversations where things start to dawn on people happens to folks who are in like communities of faith, when they go to a church or something and they have people to talk to and they have like these spaces where people can sort of think about these things. And he said, but I've just realized that I don't have that space in my life. I don't have those kinds of places where I can go where there's this kind of community. And for him, for that first time, the reading group was a place where many different kinds of people could intersect with one another to talk about their lives together. And it was a real big dawn on him that his society was one that didn't encourage that kind of gathering. And so when I think about the reading group and the way in which that sort of functioned in the context of Occupy, it's providing that kind of space that's really unique that we find very rarely in a capitalist consumer-driven society. And even when there are public spaces, they're really spaces that are governed in a long way by the state. So it's not a people's space in that kind of way. And that's part of, you know, the way that Occupy was working originally with Zuccotti Park, right, is that they expropriated a space to make it available to people for a whole different kinds of contexts. And that's the same thing I think I saw what was going on with Occupy Austin, is that you all really sort of just took this space over for a few months and really tried to do all these different kinds of experiments where you gave people opportunities to do something different that we don't normally find in our everyday lives.
I love that. Yeah, it's like this beautiful little, or it was in some places, maybe still is, one of these beautiful little anarchic pockets within the broader system, like a community garden or something like that.
Right. Well, we talked a little bit about the benefits and the sort of big aha moments that people had in these reading groups. Were there any difficulties that you faced within the reading groups? Because the reason I ask this is I know that I know Occupy Wall Street in New York often had discussions about barriers that people had to discussions, whether it was white people talking over others, men talking more than others in groups and things like this. Were there these kinds of issues going on in the Occupy Austin reading group when you had it out in public? And if so, how did you negotiate those? How did you deal with those in the context of a kind of a communal space like that?
Yeah, we absolutely had those issues. I made a little list. I knew you were going to ask this. And I think that, yes, there was the replication of kind of the problematic power structures that led to all of the problems in the first place. And it was definitely, there were definitely white men would tend to be the people dominating the conversation. And me, for some reason, like I said, I can be kind of bossy. I would try to catch myself. I think that when it was happening in the group, because for some reason I am not shy about such things, I would just tell people, you know, you're really dominating right now. I want to hear from people who aren't you, you know, or we would like to hear like from people who aren't you. But when it was maybe sometimes we would have like some kind of, you know, disruption, external disruption, you know, we either had to ignore it or sometimes I would go talk to the people and just explain like, listen, we're trying to do this thing here. We would really appreciate it if you could either join us with this like kind of calm conversation. We didn't have any people who were there just to play devil's advocate that I recall. It might have happened and I just blocked it out of my memory. But one thing, and I do recommend this, one thing I did end up doing with the second round of reading groups, which I started after the election in 2016, was to make a rule that you could not bring in any texts, that the only texts we could bring in were texts written by non-dominant groups. So people of color mostly, but maybe like disabled people or trans people or what have you. And I think that what happened when we started doing that is we were just reading about how really toxic these types of interactions can be, to the point where everybody was like, oh, we do this. And people started becoming really a lot more mindful of how they were interacting in the group. And now in this newest iteration, which I started, it's a lot of the same people from the last iteration, and this is all online that we're doing this. I started after, I think it was George Floyd. I don't think it was Ahmaud Arbery. But after George Floyd was killed, we're only reading pieces by Black authors, and we're going to open it up to Black and Indigenous authors. And I think it's really helpful to be centering those voices in terms of helping us figure out even how to interact with each other. We're not all white, but we're mostly white. And we do have a resource document that I organized that is on a Google Drive, where people, if they come across something really excellent that's been written by an author, like a non-Black author, they put it there and with like a little annotation so that we can see why it's important. So for everything out there that's written by Marx, there's like something else that might be written by a Black writer later that elaborates on that and maybe brings race into it more. So I think that's been really a positive movement, and I would recommend it to anybody who wants to start a reading group of this sort.
So yeah, no, I'm glad that you started talking about that. So after you left Austin, you continued doing this in person in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And so now this is something that with COVID-19, you've had to move virtually in many ways. Why do you think that this is, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how you thought that this was an important kind of tool for getting folks to be able to process what was going on in Occupy. Why do you think it's an important form of activism now, especially right with all the Black Lives Matter protests going on, right? Why have you continued to do this kind of work with the people that you know?
That's a good question. So it was interesting that you were talking about religious spaces earlier, because a lot of the people in my community that has been built up here have talked about, they come from religious communities, and they've talked about our meetings as like church. They call it church. And so it's different because we used to meet in my home, and now we meet online, obviously. So I think that there were a lot of benefits. At first, everybody just wanted to jump to action. Well, the first I've noticed that all 3 times that I've started one of these, the first thing that happens is like tons of people want in. They're so interested. They come, and then when they realize that it's not going to teach them how to like fix capitalism or fix racism within like a couple conversations, maybe they're like, oh, I'm going to go do something more like direct action-y, or maybe I'm going to read this on my own, or maybe I'm just like frustrated and I don't want to think about this right now. I don't know what it is, but they drop off. And then we get like a core group of people. It's dynamic, but like a kind of nebula of people that are really into this. And then what happened in 2016 is that we started building this activist community where we were like sharing information about actions locally. We were carpooling. We were building intimacies with each other. So these are now my dearest friends here. One fella found us online through Facebook and started coming, and now he lives in England. He's English, but he became roommates with someone else in the group. He just became really good friends with us. So that's really nice. It's bleeding out. So so some of the people in the group have taken it upon themselves to start writing a weekly newsletter we call them actions and reparations. So there'll be one distanced action, one in-person action, and one suggestion for reparations or donations to send, along with like a little introduction to the reading, and people have been sending this to their broader networks. We also have, what I'm really stoked about is that there are people in this community, and maybe they were on this trajectory already. Some of them I know were, some of them have told me that they weren't, who have kind of migrated their careers to incorporate social, economic, racial justice into their daily lives. So it's not just a thing you do once a week, it's a lifestyle. For my part, I just put together a film syllabus that as of now doesn't have any films by white directors. And I wouldn't have necessarily thought to do that or known how to start in terms of building up supplementary readings if it weren't for this group. So I do think it has like kind of a broader reaching impact than it can initially seem to someone who just shows up the first day and is like, "What? We're just talking."
Yeah, I mean, I've read some critiques of reading groups online. Especially, there's a lot of emphasis. We've been talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in the past few months. There has been some critiques that initially what happened after that for a lot of, especially white people, was the formation of reading groups where people would start to read different kind of anti-racist texts and think about them. And there were some BLM activists who were really, they liked the emphasis on white people educating themselves, but they felt that it was very limited kind of impact. And so what you're saying is that the reading groups that at least you fostered are ones in which you have the ability to talk about these things, process what's going on. But what you've seen then is that this energizes people then to go out and actually get involved in communities, get involved in actions in some sense. So it's a way of nurturing ideas and then energizing people to do their work.
I do think so, yeah. And I think it's a culture that a bunch of us have like really mindfully created. We've also started doing something that we're calling accountability rounds. So at the beginning of every meeting, we go around and everybody says what they did that week to like reduce the harm they do in this world or try and mitigate it. And so luckily we have the newsletter that can point us towards really concrete things. So it isn't overwhelming for people. And it definitely, like, it has me doing a lot more than I would normally. And we also try and emphasize that this is not an action. This is a self-purification that prepares you for direct action. So, we, in some of our communications and at the beginning and or end of some of our meetings, we try to remind people, like, this doesn't count as you doing good in the world. This is for us to like get right with ourselves, maybe create this community space and energize us to go do right in the world. And I think that I read those articles too, and I completely agreed with them. They can be like kind of a band-aid, or they can be a distraction. Like if you've got 2 hours on a Tuesday night and you could go, do something like more direct that Black organizers are asking you to do, do that. Don't come to reading group. Do that thing. You know, that's more important. This is more social almost, or it's more for you or for us. It's not for the world as much, although I do think it really directly helps the world, or indirectly helps the world through the mechanisms I was describing.
Yeah, no, I think I think there's something that I learned. I mentioned at the beginning the work of Grace Lee Boggs, and I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but
I'm not. Actually, I should be though. It sounds
no,
like.
you should. There's some really good stuff. I'll send you links later. But Grace Lee Boggs and her husband Jimmy Boggs were these longtime activists in Detroit, and organized working class multicultural groups in a lot of ways. And one of the things that they did towards their middle age was they organized a reading group amongst friends of theirs that went on for about a decade or so. And they recorded their conversations with one another. And what they were trying to do with their reading group was not only do information right and getting right by themselves, but in some sense to clarify their analyses of what was going on in society. And so they actually wrote a kind of communal book out of their discussions called, I think it's called Conversations in Maine. And it was their social theory, their social scientific analysis of the problems of late stage capitalism and organizing in a multicultural society, and how to envision a new way forward based on these communal discussions that they had. So it was both a place for them to be able to process and to be energized, but they were also think tanking it, right? In some sense of really trying to refine their theoretical analyses of what they needed to understand in order to do their work. And so that's really, you know, that's a real sort of high dedication to this kind of process of getting together to read with one another.
It does feel like a think tank often. And I feel like I'm constantly having these little epiphanies where I'm like, oh, I wish I had thought about that 10 years ago. Or, and I think that's true for a lot of people. And I'm just thinking how really special it is to be, every group has its own character. Mm-hmm. And in our group, I am the darkest. Like, I am way more doom and gloom, and like, I don't need to be wasting my time on white supremacists. I'm not going to go try and like bring them to the light or whatever it is. And then we have all of these other people in the group who are really emphasizing connection and grace and these other qualities. And so it tempers me, and then I give them an edge I think they desperately need, and they give me like some I don't know, sunshine I desperately need. And then it also helps us organize our skill sets, right? So we're creating these task forces where we're making like talking points for that we can use with people we know or people we don't know, where, you know, maybe somebody with an edge needs to come in and say like, oh yeah, shut this person down. Somebody else needs to be like, no, be a little gentle. This is your mom, like, or whatever it is. So yeah, I think we are kind of developing, and I think in each case, there's been the kind of gradual development of a group ethos that is unique, and perhaps would one day be worth writing up, although the labor of that does not sound fun to me.
Right. Has going virtual made this more difficult to do?
It's interesting. It's different. In some ways it's more difficult. In some ways it's a lot easier. So it's easier because anybody can come. It's super flexible. So we have people who aren't just local. And we disseminate the information electronically. So I've met like I think that of the core group right now, I only knew just a couple or maybe 3 of them in person beforehand. These are broader network people, which is really cool to me because it's, you know, obviously we don't have the luxury of that collective space, the people space that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. It's nice to have the Google Drive kind of accessible at all moments. We can share information in real time. We can all be looking at the same document. It's, yeah, I mean, those are basically the benefits. The hard things are, it's really hard to organize conversations. You probably know this because you teach and you do groups. It's really hard to keep conversation flowing in a group on Zoom, partially because when one person's talking, like another person will become muted with the technology. So you can't really like flow. You have to wait till someone's completely stopped making noise. People are weirdly shyer, I've noticed. And so I've found that I have to step in a lot more, or I have to like be a lot heavier of a presence as a facilitator. So I don't know if people are like watching this and want tips. It took a while to get to this structure, but it seems to be really working for us at least. Where at the beginning, people just filter in, we chit chat, then we do an accountability round. And in order to go in a round, I just type the names as I see them on the screen in the chat box, and then just people will go one after each other there. And then whoever brought the reading in introduces it, says why they brought it in, tells us where to go look at it. And then people just type in their name. So we read it out loud together. People type in their name in the chat box, and then we go in that order for reading. And then there's an open convo where I step in as much as I need to be like, you know, you look like you have hot tip. You probably know this, but if someone's going like this, it usually means they want to talk. If they're covering their mouth, it means that they want to talk, but they're shy or they don't know if they'll be heard. So you call on those people.
Nice.
Every time I've done it, they're like, "Oh yeah, actually I did it."
Huh.
And then I set a timer for you know, a certain time that we've agreed upon ahead of time, and then we do a final like closing thoughts round, and then we organize who's bringing the reading next week.
How long are your sessions usually?
They're between an hour and a half and 2 hours.
Oh wow, okay, that's all.
Yeah. Is that a lot or not a lot?
I guess it depends on the group. The convention that we have done in Occupy Corvallis has been to keep it to an hour to respect everybody's time.
That is nice.
And it's short, but you know, we do things a little bit differently than you all. But I think, you know, what you're pointing out is that one of the things that these groups really do well is build community with one another, and that can be empowering for activism. But building community is hard to do online in various kinds of ways, and so that can be it kind of inhibits in some ways the sort of natural connections that bodily presence can facilitate. So that can be kind of rough, and you have to be more intentional and outgoing, and so that might be difficult for people who are a little bit more introverted. You have to be more conscious perhaps as a facilitator to find out and pay attention to what people are doing as you're watching them.
Yeah. How does your group run? Do you mind telling me?
No, sure.
Tell me after it's over.
No, I mean, very briefly, the way that we have historically worked is we meet every 2 weeks or so, depending on the schedule, and then we read something, we discuss something that we've read beforehand. And so we don't normally have a limit on the kinds of reading. Sometimes they've been articles, sometimes they've been book chapters, sometimes they've been podcasts. And so someone each week chooses something that they want to bring in. We have a chance to look at it beforehand, and then we come in, and the person who is introducing it is sort of the kind of facilitator. They introduce it, why they thought it was interesting, maybe how it related to previous discussions, and then we just sort of go back and forth with the ideas and talk about it. And sometimes it gets really lively. And what's interesting to see over time, over the many years that we've been doing this, is the different kinds of positions that sort of line up. And they're always very, I think, friendly, but there are distinctions between sort of like the more kind of liberal minded folk who, you know, this was very clear after Occupy. There are people who were like the moveon.org, like, you know, we really need to work behind this candidate. And then there were the sort of more Marxist oriented folks who were like, well, what we really need to do is take over the state and expropriate the forces of production. And then there's the anarchist contingent who are like, well, we really just need to sort of build our own utopian spaces and we can't trust government or anyone like that. And so there's this really vibrant mix of things with different kinds of ideas. But I did want to say one thing that I think that's important about the kind of stuff that you were talking about that I've seen in our group, at least, and has been talked about by some of the folks who have been involved in it, is that, you know, the Occupy Corvallis reading group was a space, at least one individual told me, where they had an opportunity to have multi-generational conversations that often don't happen in activist spaces, where so often activist spaces are filled with either folks of kind of, you know, the boomer age, those folk, or very, very young people. And that kind of intergenerational discussion is usually very rare. You saw that come out a lot in Occupy, where there's all sorts of different people from all different kinds of ways of life, economic backgrounds, and so forth. But in at least our group, in so many of the activist spaces here in this little small town in Corvallis, the activist spaces tend to be pretty divided generationally. And so you have the students and you have most of the townies who are much older, retired folk. And this has been a unique space where a lot of those groups interact with one another and talk with one another and can share that kind of generational knowledge that you spoke about beforehand, that can be about learning about the past and then thinking about the future. And so I think that what's been interesting is the sort of community building that's come out of our group, particularly in that kind of way. And just being there together to sort of do analysis of one another and to be supportive of one another. And so that's why I asked the question about whether or not going virtually has affected the sense of community, because for our group, at least, it's been the sense of community that has been really key for so many people who've been involved.
I think that it's definitely impacted it, but I don't think it's irretrievable. I mean, I think there are ways to create a sense of community virtually. But it definitely takes a lot of flexibility and just respond. I mean, whatever works for us probably won't work for y'all, but I imagine that it would be easier for you because you have such long-standing relationships, not just with each other emotionally, but intellectually. So you can probably kind of intuit what another person's trying to say if it's harder to say it for some reason digitally.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's right. Do you see yourself continuing to do this kind of work in the future with the social justice reading group?
Yeah, I feel like I have to. I mean, it's just brought so much to my life. And I think it's made me better as a teacher, as a friend, as a community member, as an activist, as a person, as a daughter, probably. And yeah, it really does feel like it's not a choice. It's just a thing that I do. And that I feel so really lucky to live. I think where I live sounds probably kind of similar to Corvallis. I live in a small town outside of Chapel Hill that's like kind of just hippies, but grad students and professors too. And I feel so lucky to live somewhere where it's easy to just kind of fall into a community like this and then help, I don't know, create a really positive culture. People are doing such exciting work here lately, which is really important because we have a lot of Nazis and neo-Confederates. So I kind of like wrote out a list of like benefits that I think the group has given me.
Yeah, what would that be?
So this is me personally. This is not what one can get from a reading group, but for me, it's helped give me a clear roadmap of or a menu of high and low risk tactics to take in my activism. And when I don't have that menu or that roadmap, I know where to go find it. It's given me a lot of tools that I need to begin reducing the harm I do as a white person through my privilege, and helped give me the tools to really see the connections between white supremacy and capitalism that have been connecting like that moment in Occupy very clearly to me with this moment in COVID, with the, with all of the demonstrations against police violence. It's given me the resources to help me identify and name my values. Because I remember at the beginning of Occupy, I wasn't sure how I felt about a lot of the things we were talking about. And it really has taken me most of a decade to really become clear on what I believe and what I think is most important. And it's given me this little coterie of people that I really care for, but also trust to do their best and help me do my best. And then it's also just kind of like a little, every meeting we have feels like a little revelation to me. These days, I really learn so much from them. They think things I could never in a million years get my brain to think. And wow, how special is that?
That's cool. That's cool. Good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up our discussion. I want to thank you for your time and for sharing your work, and just personally for being such an inspiration in the way in which you approach these issues thoughtfully and have created opportunities for people to come together to be able to think about how they want to go out and to become and to enact social change. So thank you for that. We'll have to see about putting our groups together at some point to
I think
meet.
it would be really cool. I mean, you're always welcome at one of our digital meetings.
And we'll also try to see if we can put some links to some of your writing on this, your classic article on Occupy Austin, and then links to the social justice reading group that you have now, and to get connection with you. So we'll make sure that people have a chance to interact with you in some way. So thanks once again, Nicole. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's like really an honor and pretty exciting that anybody wants to hear me talk about this for so long. So I don't even know if you wanted to hear me talk about this for so long, but that's what you got. So
no, it was great. Thank you. And so thank you all for listening as well, that you've come to visit us here at the Anarres Project. If you have any questions, you can find us on social media at Anarres Project, all one word. Our website is anarresproject.org. You can go ahead and leave us some comments down below, and you can also check on some of the other videos and conversations that we've had with activists on our YouTube channel. You can also find some of our audio podcasts on SoundCloud. So thanks again very much to everyone who's shared their time with us. Thanks again, Nicole, and see you soon.
thanks.